Hello. Hello, everyone. I believe that this is live. The computer tells me we are live. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on our inaugural Sister District Book Club chat with author David Daley, the author of Ratfked, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. Hopefully YouTube will not censor me for saying the name of your book.
I hope not. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Sister District, for everything you are doing. It's such an important fight, and I'm thrilled to be the first choice of this book club.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to have you here with us. So I am Gaby Goldstein. I am co-founder and political director at the Sister District Project and director of research at RC4, which is the Sister District Action Network. We have about an hour today, and so I have a rather ambitious agenda of topics to discuss. So we'll see how far we get. But I'll just give you all a quick overview of what I hope we can accomplish this hour. So first, I'd just like to start out with a few words about Sister District, who we are, what we're up to, and then really get into the meat of this really fabulous book that we have all read together, which is Ratfked. And there's a few pieces that I'm hoping we can talk about. The first is really why state leg matters and why we should care about state legislatures, and then talk a little bit about gerrymandering, the mechanics of it, what it is, and why it's so destructive to our democracy. And then spend a little time talking about how we got here. What are the factors that went into this current state of affairs where we find such an array of gerrymandered districts across the country? And then spend a little time looking forward in terms of where do we go from here? What are the options that we can pursue to ameliorate this situation and dig ourselves out of this gerrymandered hole? So that is the goal. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, it sounds ambitious. We'll see. We'll see how far we get. Yes. So just a few words about Sister District. We are a grassroots organization of volunteers from around the country organized into local teams, and our mission is to elect more Democrats to state legislatures. That is our sole goal and mission. We came together after the 2016 election and really looked at the issue of state legislatures as an area that has been overlooked by the party, as Ratfked certainly elaborates for us, but also by the public. It's a type of it's an arena where we don't typically spend too much of our time thinking about state leg, but it's critically important for all the reasons that we'll talk about. And so our organization focuses on electing more Dems to state legislatures, as well as focusing on ways that we can deepen our civic engagement, and one of which is our fabulous book club. So we'll be reading 4 books this year, and I'm so delighted that Ratfked was our first book, and even more delighted that David has joined us for this chat. So with that, let us turn to some of these complicated topics that hopefully we can digest and dig into a little bit. And the first one is really, why state leg? Why should we care about state politics and state legislatures? I think that your book makes a really clear case for so many of the ways that state leg has an outsized impact on our lives, but would love to hear your perspective about that.
Sure. I think that you're absolutely right. We've overlooked it for too long, and the Republicans realized that was a loophole. It was the perfect bargain, that in a gridlocked Washington, D.C., where nothing could get done, that if the Republicans were able to spend a little bit of money and focus down ballot, they would be able to do 2 things. First is advance a very conservative agenda within states that otherwise they would not be able to work those kinds of bills through. and they would have a perfect laboratory for all of their conservative ideas, and they would essentially be able to pass all of this legislation completely insulated from the ballot box and the voters. But two is that they understood that state legislatures is where the power lies to draw district lines, not only for themselves and their own state legislatures, but for Congress. And they understood that if they could take control of those state legislatures in 2010, that they would be able to draw themselves a lasting and durable majority in the states and in Congress that could last at least a decade, possibly longer if the cards all fell in their direction. So I think all you have to do is look at the kinds of legislation that has come out of Ohio, the sort of abortion legislation in Ohio, or in Michigan, where you saw an emergency manager bill passed by a gerrymandered state legislature that was then overturned by the voters at referendum and then returned to power to existence by a gerrymandered state legislature. And that leads to the kind of catastrophe and tragedy you see in Flint, Michigan, with kids drinking poison water. You look at the transgender bathroom bills in North Carolina, and you look at the fact that the very first thing that the gerrymandered state legislatures do before all of this other legislation is they go after voting rights. They pass voter ID bills. They limit the number of days of absentee balloting or early voting, or do things to surgically and precisely target the votes of minorities and Democrats. So if you don't have power in state legislatures, you don't have a seat at the table for all of these policy fights in your state. And if you lose that power in a redistricting year, you might not get that seat back for another decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's not just so there's all these different ways in which state leg really has somewhat of an outsized role in so many political processes. There's the districting process, which is controlled by state legislatures in so many states, and then there's this way in which state legislatures are the pipeline for leaders who become, who go on to the national stage. Half of all presidents started as state legislators, and policy pipelines, right? This is really a place where Republicans have focused for a long time in growing, taking that Brandeis quote to the extreme in terms of having states be laboratories for very regressive policies, which travel to other states through ALEC, which we could talk about as a forum for the dissemination of conservative state policies, and otherwise. So there's a variety of ways in which focusing on state legislatures is a good bang for the buck, so to speak, not just financially, but yes, financially it's very cheap compared to federal races, but also for these sorts of pipeline issues for leaders and policies.
I think that's right. You talk about laboratories of democracy. I think what we have are meth laboratories of democracy these days in all of these things. But you're also absolutely right that the state legislatures are where the future benches get created. And I think that you're completely spot on there, that one of the reasons that gerrymandering is so important is that it has really limited the Democratic bench in a lot of these key states. And we're talking about states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina, states that are competitive, that are purplish or blue-leaning. And if you look in those states, you've got Republican supermajorities in many of them. And as a result, it becomes staggeringly difficult to create a bench for congressional candidates or US Senate candidates or Secretary of State candidates. And all of that is deeply interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like we have a good base for why we should care about state legislatures, and critical to everything we've just said is really the issue of gerrymandering and the fact that in so many states the district lines, not just for state legislative districts but also congressional districts, are drawn by the state legislature. So I'd love if you'd tell us a little bit about what gerrymandering is and how it works, and how the sort of corrosive nature of what packing and cracking does to the voices of voters.
Well, gerrymandering is the dark and ancient art of drawing district lines in such a way as to maximize the power of the party holding the pen and to minimize or dilute the power of your opponent's party. It has been with us for an awful long time. You can trace it back to Patrick Henry trying to Ratfuck James Madison out of the very first Congress down in Virginia. It gets its name from Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry in 1812, whose Democratic Republican Party draws a bunch of state Senate districts around Boston that resemble a salamander in the eyes of an editorial cartoonist. And all of a sudden, this great founding father and vice president and Declaration of Independence signer is reduced to an anti-democratic footnote in history forever. But it really, there's two main ways of doing it. As you said, there's cracking and there's packing. So essentially packing means when you draw the map, you try to corral as many of the other side's voters into as few districts as you possibly can, districts that they then win with an overwhelming amount of votes, but it leaves all of the surrounding districts free for your side. The other way is by cracking, and then you are essentially spreading those votes out as thinly as you can so that it is just incredibly hard for them to ever be able to coalesce around a representative of their own choosing. Both of these methods are incredibly insidious and dangerous to a democracy because they completely overwhelm the idea of votes counting and of basic proportional fairness, which a lot of people will quickly say, well, we don't elect members of Congress or state legislatures by statewide proportional fairness. But it's fundamentally wrong when a state like Pennsylvania, for example, Democrats get 51, 52% of the votes, but only get 28% of the seats because of the way that the lines are drawn, or a state like Ohio, in which Republicans might get 51, 52% of the vote, but take 12 of the 16 seats, 75% of the votes. It shouldn't be possible for all of these states, Ohio, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and I keep coming back to the same states, and I will all night, because these are where the problem is really centered in so many ways. Where in 2012, Democrats get more votes for the state house in these states, but are often staring down the wrong end of supermajorities. This is not what people sign up for in a representative democracy. It dilutes the power of your vote, and it warps the very nature of representation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you provide so many incredible examples of this. I'll just mention a few just for a flavor of it. But you know, in Michigan in 2014, the five Dems who won congressional seats won with an average of about 70% of the vote, but the 9 Republicans who won with an average of only 57. So we see there that the way that the lines have been drawn packs Democrats into those 5 districts where they win with an overwhelming majority of the vote. And then the rest of their vote, sort of the Republicans get all the other districts is the bottom line there, with a much lower percentage of the vote. So they don't need 70% of the vote. They don't want 70% of the vote. The idea is to have the fewest number of democratically held districts where the Dems win by these astronomical margins, and then the Republicans get everything else with much lower but winning margins.
Exactly. I think that's right. I mean, in 2012, you get the same 9 out of 14 in Michigan, and the Democrats got 240,000 more votes that year statewide. So when you can take 9 of 14 seats with 240,000 fewer votes, that is pretty effective. And what that does is it tells Democrats in these other districts, maybe I'm not going to run in 2014. If I'm an ambitious Democrat in Michigan and I'm looking at a congressional race, I say, maybe I'll run for state senate instead or something else, because it's going to be hard for me to fundraise. It's going to be hard for me to win. I might not be taken seriously. And then you begin to see what you saw in 2014 and 2016 in so many of these states, which are completely uncompetitive districts in which you don't even have a major party challenger.
Right.
So
yeah.
A gerrymandering like this can take away the very notion of electoral choice.
Totally. And so not only does this sort of gerrymandering dilute the voices, so to speak, of Democratic voters, but it also makes Congress more extreme. And so I think this is one of the things that is really powerful for folks all over the country to understand, which is that this sort of gerrymandering at the state legislative level, when state leg draws the congressional lines, it actually has an effect. And Theta Scotchpole and others have shown that the federal Congress is becoming more extreme as a result of the gerrymandering. Can you connect those dots for us?
Yeah, I think that this is really fascinating, and I have so much respect for Theta and her work, especially since there are so many political scientists who simply have not caught up to what happened in 2010 or kind of understood how this gerrymander is so fundamentally different. And the example that I think is the most telling, it comes out of North Carolina. And North Carolina had been a Democratic state in 2008. Republicans targeted it in 2010 with the goal of flipping both the state house and the state senate in their direction so that they can redistrict the entire state to their benefit. The state representative who is in charge of the redistricting decides that he wants a 10-3 congressional map. Why? Well, because, as he has actually said in courtrooms, because I do not think that I can draw an 11-2 map. So he goes out to draw a 10-3 Republican map. And the way that they do this is by taking Asheville, the hippie vegan mountain college town out in the western mountains of the state, the largest city in western North Carolina, which had been electing a conservative Democrat named Heath Shuler to Congress. And they crack Asheville in half. They put half of it in the 10th, half of it in the 11th. The new 11th district, Shuler looks at it and says, I can't run and win here. He retires. The important election here is no longer the general election. It becomes the Republican primary. So the base turnout is all that matters. The person who wins the Republican primary is a candidate who runs on a promise to send Barack Obama back to Kenya or wherever it is he comes from. You can go on YouTube and you can find Mark Meadows campaigning on this in the summer of 2000. And Meadows wins that seat. Mark Meadows is now the chair of the House Freedom Caucus. Mark Meadows is the member of Congress who files the vacate the chair a motion that puts into motion the resignation of John Boehner. It is Mark Meadows who drives the 2013 shutdown. It is Mark Meadows who pushes the tax care, the Trump care bill further to the right, who forces a million different veto votes over Obamacare, who's involved in the shutdown earlier this year. Mark Meadows owes his seat in Congress to redistricting. This is what happens when you redistrict in such a way as to create all of these uncompetitive districts. You put the base in charge, you put the primary voters in charge, and say you live in Asheville, say you are one of the, tens of thousands of Democrats in Asheville, you have zero influence over who your member of Congress is.
Yeah.
It's bad for the members of Asheville, but it affects the entire country. It changes the tone of the politics for all of us when this is the case.
Yeah, and so the sort of tied into that is this notion that when districts are not competitive, members of Congress just don't have any incentive to compromise, to govern, to deal with the other side, because the only potential backlash, the backlash there would be someone even more to the right challenging them in an upcoming primary. And so you make this point, I think, so eloquently, that most of the country really is in the middle. But when you draw the lines in such a way to pack and crack, the middle gets left behind, so to speak. The middle has no voice because of this sort of mathematical partisanship.
We have maybe 30 to 40 swing districts left in the entire country out of 435. And that means that you've got 400 districts that essentially who is going to win them before the first vote is cast and which party is going to be in charge of them. And that changes the very nature of Congress as a result. Members are in fact disincentivized to do the actual work that we think of as being crucial to the art of governing, compromise, reaching across the aisle. All of these things, you're right, are the kinds of things that earn you a primary challenge from someone who says, I'm even crazier than you are, and gets, a lot of talk radio love as a result of that. But there is a way forward, even on the issues that we think of as being the most controversial issues, even if it's immigration or gun control or healthcare. There are huge majorities that back a consensus, kind of common sense, a way forward. And I'm not making some kind of no labels argument here. I'm saying that there are lots of issues that we think are controversial that are not really controversial, that get ginned up into sort of a phony blue versus red because our politics has been pushed into such an extreme, toxic, and uncompetitive state of affairs in the legislature.
Totally. And the one thing that I think is really interesting is you talked to former Democratic Congressman Price about whether this was ever the case on the left. And his response was never. So you asked him if Democratic Congresspeople ever feel worried about challenges to the left for their own primaries, and the response was never. And I'm really curious about that. I mean, Barbara Lee speaks for me here in Oakland, Berkeley, but why isn't there more of a push for this type of extremism on the left in those districts, particularly, as we say, some of them are very, very Democratic districts. I mean, places where, because of the packing, Dems are winning more than 80%, but you don't see this kind of push to the left the way that you see the push to the right. I'm curious about that.
I think it's a great question. There's something about Democrats that they just have not adopted those kinds of aggressive ideological primary challenges. I mean, I have a hard time thinking of any, with the exception of like Ned Lamont taking on Joe Lieberman in Connecticut for the Senate in 2006. There's just not an awful lot of them, and that could change this year. You just saw the primary that failed in Illinois against Congressman Lipinski. So perhaps there are Democrats who are a little more frustrated with the kinds of non-resistance tactics from some members, and are going to give them a little bit of a harder run. To which I say, terrific. That's what a democracy is. I mean, nobody ought to be allowed to have these seats for life. We elect these members every 2 years for good reason, and there ought to be a competitive election every 2 years. Republicans have been primaried, I think, more often from the right, and it led them to move further to the right, because you only have to watch a fellow member of Congress lose once or twice to understand, okay, I'm simply not going to let anybody get farther to my right. So they change the way that they act. Democrats in many of these districts are able, win at 70 or 80%, and they probably have a pretty liberal. I mean, the thing about gerrymandering is I do think that it has pushed the Democratic caucus further left as well. It has reduced the number of them. It has made them more liberal. It has gotten rid of the conservative Democrats in the South. They just don't exist anymore. That they're simply not in the party. So you probably do have a smaller and more ideological caucus now than you had earlier.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's the perception that the Democratic caucus has gone, not to stray too far, but I think there is a deep ideological divide in the Democratic Party right now, and there is a struggle afoot. There is a leadership. There is opportunity for leadership. Let's put it that way. Great opportunity for leadership. But yeah, I do think it's really interesting that there's at least much more of a perception that the right has used this sort of primary hard and move to the right tactic more than the left has. But it is interesting. Oops. Yes. And so let's see. I think it is time for us to talk about how we got here. You go through a number of factors that partially explain. I mean, this is a multivariate situation. It's not one thing that's led us here. It's a number of things over a very long period of time, and I think one that we've been talking about already is there is this theory that that uncompetitive districts are really just a function of where people live, because we've all sorted ourselves into to live in places that are generally aligned with our ideological values. And I think you make a really compelling case that that's really not sufficient to explain what's going on here. And really, you put forth an institutionalist account of how we find ourselves here. And so I'd love to hear about that.
I think that's right. I think that the big sort is not only not sufficient to explain the current situation we're in, but that it's wrong. If you actually look at clustering in the states that have the most serious toxic partisan gerrymandering, Republicans have become more clustered than Democrats in many of those states. So essentially, the big sort argument is that we have self-sorted ourselves. We have chosen to sort of live in bubbles, that Democrats are packed not particularly efficiently into big cities, and Republicans are spread out more efficiently in rural areas and suburbs. And okay, it's entirely possible that some of that is true. We have certainly siloed ourselves into social media corridors, and we watch ideological news. The siloing of America is certainly real. But I think in 2012, what you see is that clustering can't explain the dramatic change that we see within those 4 years. And I go back again to the same key 5 states that I keep talking about: Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin. Democrats get more votes for the state house in 2008 in all 5 of these states, and that gives them control of the state house in those states. In 2012, they also get more state house votes in these states, and they don't control a single one of them. So between 2008 and 2012, did all of the Democrats in all of those states cluster themselves around Ann Arbor and Philadelphia and Chapel Hill, or did something else happen? Well, something else happened. The lines changed in between then. These districts are not drawn in such a way, they're not drawn in squares, right? They're not capturing all of the Democrats in Philadelphia in a square. They're using, we did not cluster ourselves into the shape of Pennsylvania's 7th, Donald Duck and Goofy. Nobody clustered themselves into that district. We were sorted into that district by big technology and by big data, which makes it more possible than ever to draw lines that are precise and surgical and perfect and incredibly hard to beat. One last point on this, because I think it's really important, and it's reared its head on gerrymander Twitter all day today. Stay off gerrymander Twitter. Don't go there.
Hot tip. Stay away.
It's a dark place. And if you are to believe that this is all self-clustering and that geography is destiny, it would then have to follow that it was simply impossible to draw. It's not impossible to draw a fair map in these states, despite geography. I think that it's entirely that some of the geographic clustering is reasonable and acceptable, but it does not follow from that you cannot draw maps that are fair and that are not infected with partisan bias. We know this because sometimes 8th graders do it as a class test, because college kids do it. Professors do it. Anybody with Dave's mapping software, which is not named after me, is able to do it. A Daily Kos has done tremendous maps from every state that have basic partisan fairness to them. So these maps are partisan choices that we end up with. These outlier partisan maps are choices, and there are a lot of smart people, whether political scientists or journalistic pundits, or on the other, or partisans on the Republican side, who want to tell us that this is about geography. It's an excuse. It's not true, and the courts have rejected it time and again. in Wisconsin, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania. The courts have looked very carefully at all of these geographic arguments, and they've said it's not the case.
Yeah.
It could be a small piece of it, but it's not the major factor. The major factor is partisan intent.
Yeah, absolutely, which is a great transition to talk about RedMap. And so, I mean, I think that the point that you're making about the big sort is that even if it's partially true in some sort of, gross way, not gross as in disgusting, but gross as in, first cut kind of way, it certainly doesn't explain the type of maps that we have. And there really is something else at work. And that something else is, at least in part, RedMap. And which was, you go through, and you had such great access to folks who were so willing to talk to you on the Republican side about the depth and complexity of the strategy. And it was incredibly effective, and I would love to hear about it.
Yeah, the journalists and the political scientists who believe in geography are simply unwilling to take the Republicans at their word, to look at what they said they were going to do, and then what they did, and then what the impact of it has been. This really is a story of two elections in many ways. It's a story of 2008 and of 2010. And the Democrats in 2010 elect Barack Obama, the first African-American president. They have a supermajority in the US Senate. They have a big majority in the US House. And the smartest minds in American politics on both sides, on all networks, thought that the Republicans were going to become a minority party in this country for a generation, that the demographics were changing, that the Democrats had a coalition of the ascendant, right? That it was inevitable that Democrats were going to lead for many years moving forward. Well, it didn't exactly work that way, right? So Democrats coasted on that sense of inevitability. Republicans strategized. They got to work, and they realized that 2010 presented an opportunity because it was a census year, and that the census year coincided with a midterm election in which the party on the out tends to do better. So what the Republicans realized was that if they had a plan to use redistricting as their path back to power, what you had to do was figure out the rules for drawing the lines in all 50 states, and then figure out how you could have complete control over that process in as many of those states as possible. In something like 41 of the 50 states at the time, it was the state legislatures that controlled that process. It was a handful of commission states, a handful of states that only had one district, so they're not drawing any lines. And they set out to take control of all of those chambers. In many states, it was as simple as flipping one seat. A state like Pennsylvania, in 2010,
those were the days. Those were the days.
102 Democrats, 101 Republicans. So the entire gerrymander in Pennsylvania that locks in a 13-5 Republican delegation for this entire decade up until the special election the other night, as well as the supermajority in the House and Senate that might make it possible to impeach the state Supreme Court justices that provided the ruling against partisan gerrymandering there, all comes from flipping a 102, a 101 state legislature. So if you want an example of why state leg matters, there you go right there. That's one district, and that's the impact of it electorally. But Karl Rove writes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in March of 2010, and he lays it out. And he says, if we can win 107 state legislative seats in 16 states, we will have the power to draw on our own, with no Democrats at the table, more than 190 of the 435 U.S. House seats. And that was what they did. They won several hundred seats that night. It was a big Republican year, but what mattered was those 107 in all of those key states I've mentioned too many times already. And they were able to lock in control in all of those states.
Totally. And I mean, it's just what you said. It's like Democrats are unwilling, and political scientists are unwilling to just take the Republicans at their word. I mean,
I have their PowerPoints, I have their emails. I mean, take a look at them, guys.
Right. They weren't being cagey about it. It was a very public, a surprisingly public strategy. And so, I mean, one question that I have about that is it perhaps because there's something more consolidated about the machinery on the right? I mean, I've certainly, seen this in other ways now, running a political organization on the left, but there isn't such a the left is much more diffuse in many ways in terms of the infrastructure, the fundraising infrastructure, the money infrastructure, and sort of more general infrastructure. And I'm wondering if that played a role in the ability to coalesce around a strategy like this and execute it in a way that, may hamper the Democrats.
The right organizes to win. And they are able to put their differences aside to go out and win. I mean, evangelicals for Trump, right? I mean, they are able to put their differences aside, even when it seems like they're compromising core principles to do so. And I think you're right about Democrats. I think the fundraising structure is more diffuse. I think that these questions of representation on the left are complicated by race as well, because I think that there's been a sense on the Democratic side that if they go after more seats, or that if they spread Democratic votes out in a way that allows them to win more seats, that there might be fewer seats for members of color. And I think that is, not something to be dismissed. But the Republicans also had to convince their donors to spend money on this. I mean, Chris Jankowski, who came up with this plan, the executive director, something called the Republican State Leadership Committee, that told me when we talked for the book that much of the Republican money, like the Democratic money, loved the bright lights, big city of a presidential race or a Senate campaign. And he had to convince these big donors that their money would go farther if they put it into state races. And it took some doing to, convince the big money people at all of these companies. But
I love that you have a quote in there that he said, which was that he wasn't just offering access anymore. He was selling a political outcome.
Yes.
And that's so powerful. I mean, it's bold. It was bold of him to, put that forth. He happened to pull it off, but
we ought to step back and admire the audacity and the singularity of what they did. It was brilliant. I mean, if you look at it from a Democratic point of view, it's also, slightly demonic, I suppose. But what they pulled off was reinventing the oldest trick in the book. In a really technologically savvy and modern way. And they did it by, not completely in secret. They announced it on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal. So, I mean, I've said this before, I don't blame the Democrats for not coming up with the idea. I blame them for not having the political skill to play defense in 107 state legislative races when Karl Rove tells them on the op-ed page of the biggest newspaper in the country where he's coming for them and what he's going to do once he's won.
Yeah, totally.
Political incompetence.
Totally. And I definitely want to talk about the Democrats, but the one last thing I wanted to say about Red Map that I think is really important is that it wasn't just an electoral strategy. Like, they had the electoral strategy and they went after, they did their targeting and they put in their money and they did the whole thing. But then at the end, they had to ensure that these new majorities stayed in power, and so they had these the districting experts on retainer for free to the chambers that they had helped elect, and so it was really that like last piece that was really important too, right? Like making these resources available.
They claimed the spoils in 2011,
right?
And they were intent on claiming the spoils of the victory, because that was the entire purpose of running this play, was to be ready in 2011 with the software, with the lawyers, with the map makers, and with all of the data sets that it would take to draw lines that would lock in their power for the next decade. That was the purpose of doing this. And state after state, you see what they did. I mean, in Ohio, they locked themselves in the bunker, which is a DoubleTree hotel, and they don't tell anyone where they are, and they use personal email, and they go ahead and they get all of these, crazy data sets, and they draw these deeply partisan voting indexes in order to predict what's going to happen over the course of the next decade in all of these districts, and they carve it up. And that's what they do in Wisconsin and Florida, North Carolina, and state after state. It's the same play and the same results.
Totally. Yeah, they really finished the job. They did the job, and then they finished it up, which I think is really important, in an important kind of coda on the whole thing. And so going back to the Democrats, I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around, certainly. Like anything, it's a multi-pronged situation, and but what I think is interesting, and your book goes through this in detail, is it kind of happened. Red Map happened at a time when the Democratic Party was really falling asleep at the wheel in a very serious way after the Obama election, and it's kind of like I don't know if you have kids, but I don't have kids, but I love Charlotte's Web, and I remember the scene where Templeton the rat, he gorges himself at the fair, and then it's like this torpid thing that the metaphor falls apart. But the point is, I mean, Dems, there was this huge landslide, and then the DNC became basically a permanent campaign committee, which the Obama administration was bled dry and run deep into the hole in a hole that eventually caused the DNC to have to cut deals with Hillary for to make payroll, and so the DNC really, instead of nurturing the state parties right at the time that they would have needed to be doing that, as Red Map was getting started between 2008 and 2010, there just wasn't any vision there for anything lower than the presidential ticket. I'm really curious about that. I mean, I know you talked to a number of folks who basically said the same thing. The party there was nothing on deck. There was no plan. It was completely off the radar. How can this be?
I mean, it's a $65,000 question. I mean, Steve Israel, who ran the DCCC in 2012 and 14, tells me that they were whistling past the graveyard. And I think that that's completely right. I think they believed that they were leading this inevitable, permanent coalition, that the demographics were on their side forever, and that they didn't have to, and that they could take their eye off of that ball. And you can't ever take your eye off of that ball. I mean, Obama, Obama in many ways governed like he was above politics, right? And
like the college professor that he is.
yes, and not, and yet he used to be an organizer, right? So he should have known better. But I think he too believed that the power and the symbolism behind his presidency and the power of his oratory would bring the country along, and we'd be on sort of a permanent arc bending towards progress. And it turned out quite differently. We, on the Democratic side, that things, bled out in hundreds and hundreds of state legislative seats over the course of that presidency. Now, I don't think he can be blamed for all of them, because if the lines had not been redrawn in 2010, Democrats would have won many of these seats back in 2012, and then would have lost a few in 14 and probably gotten a few back in 2016. But they fell asleep in 2010, and we have all been, paying the consequences for that ever since.
Totally. And it's interesting. There's a quote in the book about after Obama started the NDRC, and, that it's like, maybe he's not the right guy for this. And I think the quote was something like, if they can't get angry about this, maybe they're too bloodless for this fight, or something like that. And I think it's an important question. If Obama is really, given the fact that so much of this happened on his watch, is he the right guy to try to bring these issues?
I'm not convinced he is. Now, that said, I think Eric Holder has done a pretty magnificent job in the months that he's been leading the NDRC. But I think it's pretty clear that Obama doesn't have the stomach for the fight, by the fact that he's been relatively absent from this entire debate, right? Obama left the White House saying that fixing redistricting was going to be his top political priority after he left the White House. I believe he's done one fundraiser for the NDRC, and I don't think he's been particularly active otherwise. Maybe he'll get out on the trail.
Yeah, or maybe the brand is maybe the brand is toxic, and maybe his people understand that the brand is toxic. That he
could well be.
I don't know. I certainly think that there's a certain level to which both Obama and Holder are constrained by their legacies in their ability to kind of be controversial. Certainly, they can't be, particularly. So maybe, we'll see. I think it's very interesting. But I do think that it's an important point that, while Obama has, certainly the legacy is untouchable in many ways. That there is a part of the story where a lot of the hemorrhaging of state level democratic infrastructure happened on his watch, and it's important that we not forget that in the broader narrative about how historic his presidency was and all the rest.
I think so often over the course of the end of his presidency, when he was giving these beautiful speeches, he was showing up for a knife fight with an elegant civics speech, and that's not going to get the job done. Yeah,
totally. So we find ourselves in this position, and then where do we go from here? So we have 6 minutes. How did this happen? So I don't know if you have a little bit more time, but
happy to stick around. Yes.
Okay, cool. Well, let's see how this goes.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got.
We can't solve all these problems in 6 minutes.
But we're going to try. So, I think that one of the great things about your book is that it provides this great baseline level of understanding about the current situation and the backstory in terms of how we got here, and then also rounds it out with a variety of potential avenues that we can explore, where the places where we can go from here. And one of them is a couple of them are independent commissions and ballot initiatives. And I think that one of the things that's interesting that you really show in the book is that the devil is really in the details on these commissions. One size doesn't fit all. It really depends on a lot of things. And one question that sort of comes out of that is, so what's actionable there? If the devil's in the details and it's all contextual, how do states or people within a state figure out whether it's right for them, or how to design a commission?
Well, there's a lot of examples. So I think that now, if you're designing a commission, you can look at California, you can look at Arizona, you can look at New Jersey, at Washington, at Iowa, and you can say what's worked here and what hasn't worked here. And I think that there are successes and failures in each of these models, but that we've also learned enough to know that we can take what makes sense from each of these models and start there, and try to build. Now, every state is different. What works in Iowa, where they are able to take this entire process and put it in the hands of bureaucrats who don't use any partisan data at all, and everybody trusts the process, is unique to the political culture of Iowa. It's also unique to the fact that Iowa is incredibly white and square. And I'm not talking culturally. So you can't simply take the Iowa model and say, let's do that in Texas. It just simply wouldn't work. But there have been plenty of examples of commissions that have turned into bipartisan incumbent protection rackets. You've seen examples of commissions that have turned into sort of Trojan horse proxy battles for Democrats and Republicans, and you've seen in California kind of a little of both worlds. A lot of terrific success in having actual people drawing these lines, and an uptick in competitiveness and an uptick in responsiveness, which is to say that if a party gets more votes, they get more seats, which, in the end ought to be what we're, talking about, right? So if you're looking to draw a commission, there are examples and things you can look at. We know that when more people have input and seats at the table, that the outcome is less partisan and more fair. So that seems like it's a valuable, piece of information.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Iowa example is really interesting, and we had a question come through about it, and basically, why can't we just do Iowa everywhere? And I think this issue of minority representation is really important. And so, the fact that Iowa is 90% white makes the need to ensure minority representation essentially irrelevant. It's not an issue, but it's a very important issue that we have to grapple with and find functional solutions for in other parts of the country that are much more diverse. And it actually,
I'm sorry. I was let me just say quickly. People look at the famous earmuffs district in Illinois around Chicago, and they say, "See, Democrats gerrymander too. Look how ugly and crazy those lines are." And in fact, that district is drawn in such a way as to ensure that a Latino is able to get elected from a neighborhood that is deeply Latino, but the people that do not live, in such a way as to create a pretty square district. So that's a question of representational fairness in that district. It's not necessarily a partisan gerrymander.
Right.
There's an African-American neighborhood kind of in the middle there, And by having those two districts drawn in that way, it makes it possible for both African Americans and Latinos to elect a member of their own choosing, rather than being pitted against each other for one seat.
Yeah. No, it's incredibly important, and it kind of ties back to something we didn't get a chance to talk about in kind of the "How did we get here" section, which is the harking back to the unholy alliance and this struggle to find functional ways to ensure, minority representation without sort of cutting these weird deals with Republicans. And we see it, there's a couple of examples that you provided of similar situations more recently, for instance, in Wisconsin, in the Latino community. And I'm really curious if you have thoughts on this issue. I mean, certainly the Democratic Party needs to have the broadest tent and the most inclusive, set of strategies for all of us. But what do we do about that? I mean, shouldn't we be worried about the unholy alliance rearing its head today, or is this issue of minority representation kind of being addressed adequately in the whole gerrymandering ecosystem?
No, I'm not sure it is being addressed adequately, and now that we no longer have crucial protections of the Voting Rights Act in place, there's no assurance that it will be treated adequately and fairly in the courts either, which, I mean, in many ways is why I think we need to go beyond commissions and to think even bigger and bolder about what we do about districting. I am a big fan of a bill that Don Beyer, a congressman from Virginia, has introduced. It's called the Fair Representation Act. And that really is the largest set of congressional electoral reforms that the country has ever seen. It essentially takes our sort of single district winner take all zero-sum politics and says that has helped create so much of the partisan division and the extremism and the lack of fair balance in our representation. And it says, how about if we draw larger multi-member districts and use ranked choice voting to elect our members of Congress? If you've got larger districts, it is harder to gerrymander them, and the lines simply mean less. And if you use ranked choice voting, you essentially lower the threshold that it would take for a voting community, whether it's Latinos or whether it's conservatives or whether it's independents, libertarians, what have you. You lower the threshold that it takes to secure a seat. So suddenly you could see conservative Democrats again. These states like Kansas and Oklahoma, there are plenty of Democrats in these states, but they're not able to elect a member. That's not because of gerrymandering. It's simply because of single member winner district, winner take all. The same in Connecticut or Massachusetts or states that have entirely Democratic delegations. There are plenty of Republicans in those states. They don't have any representation either. And if you move to a system like this, you would really triple the number of seats that communities of color would have a chance to potentially elect a member of their own choosing to.
Yeah, and is that the mission of Fair Vote?
It is, yes. I mean, Fair Vote's been very active over the years as really the leading national organization centered around ranked choice voting and other electoral reforms designed to give people a stronger voice and more choices at the ballot.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds, so I mean, so I think what you're getting at a little bit there is, I mean, certainly we need I love your phrase, permanent gerrymandering disarmament plan. It's a mouthful, but
yes.
But
a little bit of a stammer.
Yeah, I would love that. That sounds amazing. I mean, I don't know how much traction we really have at the federal level. But the beauty of state level politics and policies is that we really can work on some of these non-electoral strategies at the state level. So, I mean, this is certainly something that the Republicans have taken every opportunity to pursue are these sorts of non-electoral ways to suppress voter turnout and voter engagement, voter registration. But we can build those in as a positive strategy for Democrats and for folks who think of voting issues, voting rights as civil rights issues, as one way to move forward. Where do we go from here? We focus on both the electoral and the non-electoral strategies to have a fairer representation.
And isn't Washington State the most powerful example of that?
Yes.
Democrats win one state Senate district in a special election. They take control of the chamber, they take control of the state, and then you are suddenly able to move things like automatic voter registration. That just is, if that's not a flashing sign of this is how you do it. Win control of these states, but then once you win control, be aggressive. Move an agenda.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. It's just
democracy.
Totally. It's you got to finish the job. That's the whole point.
Not enough to simply win control of these things. Once you've got them, you've got to have a plan, and then you have to go ahead and execute that plan.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we were incredibly proud to support Manka Dhingra in her race, and have just been absolutely. It is proving the case. Washington State this session has been proving the case for why state leg matters so much. And so in terms of the Democratic Party and where do we go from here? I mean, this certainly the hope is that. We're not fighting yesterday's battle. Obviously, the Republicans are ready in some way. I don't know if you have more insight, but we can't run the same plays again. Is there enough infrastructure coalescing on the left of center to be effective as we go into 2018, which is obviously a critically important set of elections in terms of the next round of districting after the 2020 census?
Boy, I am so excited by the energy that I see from so many organizations on the left, what you all are doing, what Flippable is doing. There's just such tremendous enthusiasm. You see it in the turnout. Right, in all of these special elections, all of these districts that have moved 30, 40 points since the last election, there's something happening out there. There's a reason why Scott Walker in Wisconsin doesn't want to hold those special elections for the Senate. And why, even though a court is telling the legislature that they have to, that gerrymandered legislature on a set, elected on a set of maps that a 3-judge panel has found to be an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander, is saying we're going to go back and stall and try to change the law on this. So something is happening out there, and we have to keep working. And what I want to say is that the structural impediments in front of us are significant. It's going to take a lot of work to undo them. They're not insurmountable. It's not impossible, but it might take time. It might not get cleared away in one electoral cycle. I mean, look at Virginia, right? A lot of victories in Virginia, a lot of victories you were essential to helping identify and fund and turn out help for. And Democrats won something like 225,000 more votes for the House of Delegates in Virginia in 2017. And the ping pong ball and the 50-50 tie went the other way.
Shelley, we love you.
Control of the chamber.
We love you, Shelley. We're coming back for you, Shelley.
Yep. It's going to happen. But so when that happens, what do we do? Do we lose faith, or do we fight harder? You know, I mean, in the epilogue to the paperback of the book, I sit down with Chris Jankowski again, and I tell him, hey, well, you know, I mean, Holder and Obama, they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to run a blue map. I mean, what do you think? And he's like, I'm honored. And he said, you know, I asked if he had a message for them, and he said, pack a lunch. And you know, I think that's a pretty good message for us all. You know, pack a lunch. It seems to me that there's a lot of brown bags being stuffed out there. You know, it's not just what you all are doing in state legislatures, it's what Voters Not Politicians are doing in Michigan, in which a Facebook post on November 9th, 2016 turns into a signature drive for an independent commission there with 450,000 signatures that nobody thought that they could attain. It's Ohio, where 250,000 signatures on a petition forced a gerrymandered state legislature to the bargaining table, and they were willing to put a commission on the ballot in May. You know, it's what 70,000 voters in Maine did this year in enacting a people's veto when they put ranked choice voting in place, and the legislature took it away, and they said, no, we want this, we're taking it back. You see it in North Carolina, in South Dakota, in Oklahoma, all of these states. There is so much energy and enthusiasm, but it's a lot of work. There's a lot of structural impediments in the way. The legacy of the 2010 campaign is not going to be cleared out immediately. It might not get cleared out in one electoral cycle. The lesson of this is you cannot ever take your eye off the states, and that these local elections matter, that every election matters, and we've got to turn out and fight them all if we want to renew and reinvigorate our democracy.
Absolutely. No, I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, I think that there's a concern that Dems are not, the sort of Democratic infrastructure is not raising money the way that the conservative infrastructure is raising money. I mean, I know that as of a couple of years ago, the RSLC had committed 3 times as much money to the 2020 plan, their 2020 plan, as Democrats even hope to raise, and so there's some concern that the part of the structural impediment is just money, and it is, right? It's just money. So we can do what we can do, which is small dollar donations, working working to elect great Democratic candidates that need our help through phone banking, through writing postcards, going to Canvas, sending text messages, doing all the things that we can do. But it's also incumbent on wealthy Democrats and the moneyed infrastructure to back this too, and put their money where their mouths are, and not just fund issues, but fund politics, and do it this year, because this is a really critical.
On local politics, start building it now. If you are waiting for 2020 to throw your money behind some presidential candidate because you want the bright lights big city, you are not only wasting your money, you are hurting democracy. We've got to get into this fight now. This is where we reinvigorate our democracy, at the state level, at the local level, and the fight starts now. There are seats at the table for redistricting 2021 on the table in 2018. And we're going to wake up on election day, a day after election day this year, and some of the key fights for this next round of redistricting are going to be over. And I'm talking about governor's races in some of these key states like Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, states where the governor has a veto power over maps, and where our road back in some of these state legislatures is especially rough, and it may take a couple of cycles. There are races out there that Democrats need to win if they want to have a seat at the table. And we have to stop thinking about a wave as, do Democrats take back the House? We've got to think about a wave, as in how many seats have Democrats won at the table for redistricting in 2021.
Which is exactly how Chris Jankowski defines success. There's some line where he says, I don't really care about, how many congressional seats we hold. All I care about is how many state legislatures we flip or we hold on to.
It's entirely possible that I've cribbed that line from Chris. He's a very smart guy, and we see what he's done.
Absolutely. And so one last point is on the House. A number of folks have asked me to ask you this question, which is that in the book, you have a bit of a doom and gloom perspective about the Democratic possibilities for the House this year. And folks are curious, given, the Connor Lamb election and what we saw in other specials at the state level, as well as last year's generals, whether your thoughts have changed at all on the opportunities in the House this year.
I'm not as doom and gloom as I was when I wrote this epilogue in February of 2017. I think we all probably had a little bit of a black cloud hanging above our head in those days. I think that the Pennsylvania decision, more so than any of the specials, is what gives me real optimism that suddenly something is in play. I think suddenly that opens up 4 to 6 seats that no one imagined would be in play, and that can make a huge difference if you're talking about trying to get to 24. What I always look at is, where are these seats going to come from? And to me, the challenge was in those 5 key states that I'm always babbling about. Republicans have a 49-20 advantage, and Democrats hadn't flipped a single seat blue this entire decade. So if you can't win any seats in those states because they've been gerrymandered so perfectly, where are you going to find them? Well, people said there's the Hillary Republican crossover districts, and then John Ossoff raises $30 million and still doesn't budge one of those districts. It was essentially a 48-47 district in 2016, and it becomes a 48-47 district still then. So what we saw in Pennsylvania 18 was amazing, right? But it was a 550 vote win, aided by a third-party candidate that got 1,400 votes or something along those lines. And I don't think we can necessarily count on winning 24 nail biters in the 35 to 40 districts that are probably legitimately contestable. I think it's hard. I'm a little more optimistic than I was. I think the number of Republican retirements suddenly creates open seats and gets rid of the power of incumbency in some of these districts. I think a wave is coming. I think it needs to be a tsunami, and we're still so far out. It's hard to say. I know everybody wants to look at the generic ballot every day, or Trump's approval rating, and to draw conclusions based on that. The generic ballot in mid-October 2016 from NBC and Reuters showed Democrats up from 7 to 10, and they ended up losing it 3 weeks later by 1. So people were so polarized. Our partisanship is so severe, and that's why gerrymandering works. And it's going to continue to work until there are persuadable voters who are going to put aside their red and blue laundry and realize that they have to make a change. So it's incumbent on all of us to keep working and to keep persuading.
Absolutely. And just to circle back to what we said earlier, even if we do take back the House, it's something of it could be something of an ephemeral victory if we don't also take back these state legislatures that control how you draw the lines in the first place, and which are so critical to so many policies that affect all of our lives, because the House comes and goes in a certain sense, but the lines are there for 10 years.
10 years. The House is really important. I'm not trying to deny what a significant check it would be on the Trump and conservative agenda in Washington. It would be, very, very important. But if you did not have a similar generational wave the following year, it probably goes back in 2020. So we have to be smart. We have to be structural, and kind of think through the process. That's what the Republicans did. They thought through the process and they said, okay, where are the levers of power and how do you control them? And how do we control them every place? And you control the levers of power by controlling state legislative chambers.
Love it. Yes, which is exactly our mission here at Sister District, and so yes, we are well aligned on that message. Thank you for staying over 20 minutes extra here. It's been such an absolute delight to chat. It was a delight to read your book, and we're so grateful to you for coming and chatting with us today.
Absolutely, anytime. Thank you for all of what all of you are doing. It's so hugely important. We fight on. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.